Hello, I'm Charlie Peters and you're watching a GB News original special on Britain's migration crisis, because this should have been the triumphant week for the government bringing in its new partial returns deal with France. But it's turned into a bit of a farce. It was trumpeted up as being a way to return dozens in the first week, but just a couple have left so far. Now, there's only one person to speak to at GB News for all the latest on this, and it's the Home and Security Editor, Mark White, who joins us here in the Paddington studio. Mark, it's meant to be a great week, as I've just said, but it's turned into something quite farcical. What's going on?
Well, listen, you and I are keen observers of all things migration. We could have written this script weeks ago, months ago. It was obvious that there was going to be legal challenges against the decisions that the British government had reached in trying to deport these small boat migrants across to France. OK, France is a safe third country, of course it is. But that's not going to stop the lawyers, the NGOs, the charities from doing what they have always done. And of course, the previous government knows only too well that its plan to try to get the Rwanda scheme off the ground was constantly frustrating. Not just for days or weeks or months, but for years. They couldn't get Rwanda up and running in time before the election, and of course were then kicked out of office. Well, now Labour are seeing just how difficult it is to try to enact a policy that they know would be popular with the country, to try to deport these migrants back to France. But clearly, as far as the human rights groups are concerned, they don't want that to happen. And that's what they've been doing, frustrating it to the point, Charlie, where just a tiny, tiny number of migrants have gone. So small, it's so pitiful, it's actually embarrassing. Of
course, the whole country really wants Sir Keir Starmer, his government and the new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, to get a grip of this scandal. They're quite desperate, actually, for this smash the gang strategy to work. But at the same time, opposition to the government, the Conservative, they will be allowing themselves perhaps a little bit of a wry smile about all those legal challenges that have scuppered this effort from the Labour front bench. It's a human rights lawyer as Prime Minister being outdone by his old colleagues. Yeah, I mean, I think you can forgive those former Conservative ministers a bit of a wry smile because they had to, as I said, endure this for not just months, but years, as every attempt to try to get those flights off the ground to Rwanda were frustrated by challenge after challenge. And now, of course, they're seeing Labour going through the same travails, and it's not something that clearly people in the wider country want to see. They want to see this situation gripped in a more meaningful way. But it's enormously difficult when you have what is effectively a machine that just wraps itself around the individual migrants in terms of what they do and what they offer migrants in terms of the legal challenges that they can then mount. We know what Reform UK says needs to happen here. They've got to leave the ECHR, rip up the Human Rights Act, change the whole legal regulatory framework that surrounds migration and deportation so that more action can be taken. But it seems unlikely that Labour is going to shift away from their current strategy. And reassuringly for them, there is a bit of a glimmer of hope on that front, because there was a High Court ruling earlier this week which pushed forward the Home Office strategy. Yeah, it seems to have come to the conclusion from the ruling that was handed down in the High Court that France is perfectly capable of offering the support that these asylum seekers require if they are, for instance, to claim, as some have done, that they are victims of modern slavery, that they were trafficked into the UK. That is something that the High Court believes France, with its highly developed judicial system and human rights laws, is perfectly capable of doing as well. Now, obviously, this is a partial returns deal we've got going with France. The government clearly thinks that everyone who comes in should be deported. That's what they think, that's what they say. Mike Tapp, a new Home Office Minister, was using some of that language on X this week as well, putting that on social media. But this current strategy, is that going to get a 100% removal rate?
I can't see it, to be honest. We are at the stage at the moment where a very, very small number of migrants are being earmarked for return to France. I mean, the fact was that about 40 or so were earmarked for return on the first week that they were going to get the flights off. And then after that, maybe about 50 in the subsequent weeks. But of course, as we've just discussed, the legal challenges meant that it was just a tiny proportion of that 40 that they got off the ground.
And it's not just the legal challenges, it's the numerical challenge. Of course, at the same week they're trying to do 40 and managing just a couple, hundreds more arriving on our shores, with GB News revealing the first crossings in a decent stretch of calm weather, allowing them to come across again. That's also a big issue for the government, isn't it? That every time they return a handful, many more come over.
Well, the big issue at play here in terms of this policy and the deal with France was the deterrent factor. It was meant to act as a deterrent. But how can you possibly argue that this is a deterrent when the vast majority of people coming across the Channel will not be subject of any return to France? And we've seen many, many, many hundreds that have come on the first day after we had very significant wind and adverse weather conditions in the Channel. So after 9 days, a window opened and we've seen the better part of 1,000 migrants crossing the English Channel, and yet a handful of migrants being returned to France in return. You can in no way, if you're taking a sort of reasonable, measured and objective look at the policy that's in play here, argue that this is in any way a deterrent.
Also, at the exact same time as this government is adopting a partial returns deportation strategy, lots of other countries around the world are looking at the old Rwanda scheme and thinking that could be a really effective deterrent. We know it worked in Australia, for example, offshore processing there, very different geography, of course. The US is now using some of those Rwandan deportation facilities. Do you think now that there'll be some thinking in Labour inside those Home Office ministerial meetings to say, perhaps we do need that stronger deportation deterrent with an offshore facility?
I think they have been looking at the potential of offshoring. They obviously didn't want to go down the route of looking at East Africa as the Conservatives did with Rwanda, because of all the issues that they think that throws up in terms of human rights of going to a country like Rwanda.
You've been there.
Yeah.
You went there with Suella Braverman when she was the Home Secretary a few years ago now. What was your read on the situation when you went out there from that perspective, human rights violations, etc.?
Well, I think the human rights claims that were made by Labour in opposition and by the human rights lobby were vastly overplayed. I was very impressed with what I saw in Rwanda, and speaking to government officials in Rwanda as well, they have a very different outlook on the immigration issue and what can be done to help, because they come from a standpoint of having lived through the Rwandan genocide, where so many people in that country became refugees themselves and left that area in Africa to go all around the world. Slowly but surely, many have been drifting back, and they take with them an attitude now where they want to do the very best for people on the continent of Africa, to stop them embarking on thousands of miles on treacherous journeys to go to Western nations to try to find a new life. This is an emerging economy. It is absolutely, a powerhouse in terms of new technology. They need a migrant population to help in that journey, but they want to do it as well because they feel it's a responsible thing to do. And yes, of course, there are some issues around whether they are, as we would see, fully democratic and that all of the human rights are observed. But as I say, I think that's a bit overplayed. They've been on a journey from this period with the genocide. They've got a strong man in charge at the moment, but they're still pushing forward. They are becoming, or trying to become, ever more open as a society. But of course, at the same time, they realise what has happened before in terms of divisions in that society, and they're reluctant perhaps to throw open their doors to activists. But if you're going there to build a new life, to be part of that burgeoning new economy, I am fully convinced you'd have a great life there in Rwanda. It was a remarkable country. Lots of housing that was being provided, built for them. Housing that, you know, would have taken pride of place in any street in the UK. That was being set aside for migrants, had that actual policy managed to get off the ground from the previous government.
It's a great example, perhaps, of foreign aid spending and support for an East African country that would really actually just directly benefit Britain as well. It could have been some of the most effective foreign aid spending or government spending overseas that we'd had. Now, at the same time, obviously, do you get a sense, perhaps, that a lot of the Labour activists, now MPs and ministers, who are so crude and dismissive of that policy, are sort of kicking themselves, thinking, if only we hadn't used such strong language, there could have been a way for us to swallow our pride and go back to that deterrent? Because you speak about sort of the human rights concerns in Rwanda. In your case, you think that's been overplayed a bit by the opposition, now government. But at the same time that's being sort of drum up, you have Germany deporting Afghans back to Afghanistan, run by the Islamic Emirate, the Taliban. So the rest of the continent is moving in a very different direction on this issue, and Labour is still sticking on the idea that the Rwanda scheme was cruel, evil, and, you know, wrapped up in human rights violations. At some point, Labour will need to move more in line with what the Europeans are doing, no?
And I think to an extent they are doing that. If not looking at Rwanda, they are looking at other locations that are perhaps a bit closer to home on the continent of Europe, or not far away in that sense. They were looking at Albania, for instance, until the Albanian leader decided that at the end of the day he didn't want to hatch any kind of deal with the UK government, that they were fine the way they are. But yeah, I think there's a considerable number of people within Labour, within the parliamentary party, that probably thought, let's give Rwanda a go. You never know. And I do think that actually Rwanda would have stood a chance had they been committed to it. You mentioned the trip I was on with Suella Braverman over there. We were privileged to get a sort of a briefing about how they saw the Rwanda policy being carried out. And it seemed to be the plan and the objective of them that in the first instance, for a period of time, might be weeks, it might have gone into months, 100% of those coming across the channel would have gone to Rwanda. And they thought that actually a few thousand down, and that would have broken the business model. Now, that might be right, it might be wrong. We'll never know now. But I think there's a pretty good chance. If you're coming from Africa, or if you're coming from the Middle East or Asia or wherever, and you're paying thousands of pounds to a people smuggler, to know that you're then not going to land in the country that was your ultimate destination that you wanted to land in, probably in quite short order, you're not going to be paying money to a people smuggler to take you. So it could well have collapsed the business model.
Yeah, and as these sort of hypothetical debates continue, that could be real debates happening inside the Labour Party as they sort of desperately seek more deals and more opportunities to speed up deportations and deal with this small boats crisis. We do know that while all that's going on, the numbers are atrocious for this year. I remember a few months ago I was reporting down near Dover, and I stole one of your lines. I interviewed a Labour MP, and I said, "You say you're smashing the gangs so far, you're just smashing records," which you were a little bit annoyed that I'd taken. But
not at all.
Not at all. You're delighted to see it. Delighted to see that one being spun out and me claiming it was my own. But that is true, isn't it? The numbers really are appalling. I mean, every time we check in on the statistical comparison, it's about 40% up from last year. Now, the last thing that Sir Keir Starmer wants is a year and a half into his premiership, it comes to the end of 2025, and they've had one of the worst years on record. Do you think that that record could be smashed?
Well, I think we're certainly going to pass last year's record. So that was 36,000. We're now 32,000 and rising because of the latest sort of numbers that have come across the channel. And we're told from our very well-sourced and expert producer down in Kent that later this month or for the remainder of the month there will be a few days which are still doable in terms of coming across the channel. As I say, the government has been very, very lucky really that we're not on much higher numbers and that we haven't already surpassed last year's total because of the bad weather that there has been in the channel.
Because as you always say, weather is basically the only deterrent.
100%. These are flimsy boats at the end of the day, even though they stuff 70, 80, 90 sometimes on board these boats. But if there's a swell in the channel, what the real difficulty about that is, one, the outboard motors carrying such weight just can't push through the waves. And also those waves can double up and buckle the boats. And then they just, collapse under their own weight. Everybody ends up in the water and dies. The people smugglers don't care about the people that are drowning, but they certainly care about something being bad for business. So they don't tend to push the boats out in extremes of weather. And we would, I think, have been at 36,000 already if it wasn't for the poor weather that we've had. But as conditions improve over the coming weeks, I think we will quickly surpass last year's total, and we could even, Charlie, be pushing up towards that all-time record of about 46,000 in 2022.
That would be devastating for Starmer. And you spoke about sort of the unseasonal, difficult conditions we've had in August. We have seen the gangs and the people smugglers adapting to that, haven't we? They are getting bolder, pushing out more people in more difficult conditions because there's a business and there's a supply of people for them to work with. But also, you revealed earlier this year in an exclusive about this super mega dinghy, as you called it. They're adapting to these conditions and they're trying to operate in more austere wind and waves. Yeah,
they're forever pushing the boundaries because it's in their interest, obviously, to get those small boat migrants out as often as possible and in ever greater numbers. If you can get more migrants on a boat, you're not then, as cheap as these things are, paying for another boat and an outboard motor. So you're clearly doing that. That's why they're pushing more people onto boats. That becomes dangerous in itself. But if we see next year this mega dinghy being introduced much more regularly, expect the numbers, Charlie, to absolutely rocket next year.
Mark White, Home and Security Editor, thank you so much for your time today. Well, there you've had it. It's a seriously precarious situation for Sir Keir Starmer and his Labour government. He's insisting that they are going to smash the gangs, but there are some stark warnings there from Mark White, our man, always on the coast and with the latest figures and lines coming across the English Channel. You've been watching a GB News original with me, Charlie Peters. Make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube and stay tuned and I'll see you at the next one.